Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. The Song of Kiều is a classic of Vietnamese literature. As a matter of fact, whenever I ask my Vietnamese students about it or I mention it, they always tell me, or at least 90% of the time, oh yeah, we read that in school. And not only that, but they are just fascinated by the fact that I have also read it. I read this poem about 4 years ago, and I really want more readers to experience it. So I reread it, and here I am making a video on it. Do you like a good story? Do you like strong female characters? Do you like great poetry? Well, you have it all in this book, so let's explore it. Our author is Nguyễn, who was born in the year 1766. When he passed away in 1820, a friend of his published what we know now as the Song of Kiều, or more appropriately, closer to the original title, the story or the tale of Kiều. It is my understanding that if somebody asks us, what is the classic of Vietnamese literature? If we can just choose one, I think I understand that this would be it, or at least it would make number two. It is just a very close call. And yet the text is based on a Chinese historical novel, and so the setting is also in China. Now, this is not uncommon, just so you know, in the literature of the region. For example, you may find classics of Korean literature that also have a story that is Chinese in origin and in setting, and sometimes maybe even in characters. But there's a big difference here. Nguyễn took the original story, he condensed it, and then he put it in a type of verse that is known as lục bát. That just means 6/8, but just to give you an idea, that is the equivalent in the Vietnamese language of iambic pentameter. Not because of the way it sounds, not because of the meter so much, but because of the prestige, I would say, that goes with something like iambic pentameter. It's the kind of meter that you use for important things, for important stories. So that is what I mean when I say the equivalent. Now, a word, and I mean just a word about the structure. Okay, I have the Penguin edition right here. This is a relatively new translation by Timothy Allen, and it is 150 pages in length, the actual poem, though it also, I'm going to say, has a fantastic introduction or introductory material. You can see how much of the book it is, some notes also, and then the poem itself, going back to the issue of the structure, is divided into 6 parts. That's all that I want to say about that. So let's talk about the story. Okay, what is this story about? The Song of Kiều could be subtitled A Woman's Journey, or if you want, A Woman's Difficult Journey. In a nutshell, we follow our heroine, Kiều, of course, through a series of unfortunate events that she experiences in her life. Kiều is a very beautiful woman, but she is also an accomplished artist. Okay, so these two things are very important. She is a painter, she is a singer, she is a poet. At the beginning of the poem, she goes to visit her ancestors' graves in the company of her family. But there's a specific grave that grabs her attention for some reason. So she asks about it, and her brother tells her that this is the grave of a woman named Dam Tien, and she is a woman who died before she could marry. Now there's a connection right there that Kiều establishes. For some reason, the story of this woman resonates with her, and she comes to see her immediately as a sister, a spiritual sister, I would even say. So that's a connection that she makes right there just by visiting this tomb. Now at that point, while they are there at the cemetery, a poet appears, and Kiều and this poet fall in love. That very night, Dam Tien appears to Kiều in a dream, and she tells her that, quote, her fate is sealed for sorrow. So we have an announcement right here. Sure enough, very soon the poet that Kiều is in love with has to leave due to a family matter that has just arisen. Then bailiffs come to the house of Kiều because her father owes money, and Kiều is basically forced to marry an older man in order to pay for her family's debts. This is the beginning of the tragedy, or of the difficult destiny, if you will, that Kiều experiences in this poem. So the whole story, the entire tragedy, is basically precipitated by Kiew's sense of filial piety. Okay, so the idea that family comes first. And from that point on, Kiều is going to experience one difficult situation, one problem after another. And this is what we follow in the story of the poem. So the older guy, that I just told you about, the husband, the new husband that she has, turns out to be a scoundrel. So she escapes. She ends up with another man, but it just so happens that the man has another wife. The other wife gets jealous. She turns Kiều basically into a slave. She manages to escape that. She becomes a nun. She becomes the wife of a warrior. And you see what I'm saying. It's one thing after another. It's a very difficult road that she is on. Eventually, she meets Dam Tien again, because Dam Tien had told her that at some point the two of them were going to meet again at the Kiang Tang River. So at that exact point, when they meet again, that's when the climax to the story comes. And it would just be absurd if I told you about it. Okay, I think I would ruin the experience of reading the poem for you. So far, I have just given you a sketch of the story, but I really want you to experience all of these things, and especially the climax of the story by yourself. So I'm not even going to tell you if this is a happy ending or an unhappy ending, but I am going to say it's a really interesting ending. Okay, and I know that we use the word interesting for basically everything, when we want to escape the idea of saying something about something, but when you read it, you're going to see what I mean when I say that it's interesting. It's unconventional. It's not the type of ending that you would get to a story like the one that I am describing. Themes. Okay, let's talk about that. Cruel fate has cursed all women. I am quoting the poem right here. That is probably the main theme that you're going to find in the Song of Kiều. Now, as you can imagine, the problem here is not so much fate itself, but the fact that women live in a male-dominated society. So that is the problem that we have here. It is called fate, but the idea here is that life under the circumstances, under the social structures that they live in this time, in other times, is just very difficult. Life is very difficult for women. So that is probably theme number one. Another very important theme is love versus duty. We have this typical dichotomy here. So at the beginning of the poem, when Kiều meets the poet, right, at the cemetery, you're going to see her experiencing that love, right? But then very, very clearly and very soon, duty comes into the picture. And she chooses duty. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. Now, closely related to that, the idea of love versus duty is the concept of family ties. And the poem actually says that people in a family are tied by silken threads. It's kind of like our equivalent of when we say blood is thicker than water. This idea that family ties are what matters. So in the context of this poem, I would say that duty that we talked about before, love versus duty, that duty is really family ties, the importance of family. Another concept that I saw, another theme, is the theme of honor. Honor is something that has to be very, very closely, very carefully guarded, something that if you lose, right, then there are serious consequences to that. But I'm also going to say the poem resolves that issue of lost honor in a really, really nice way. You're going to see this at the end of the poem too. But I'm just thinking about this. Family, honor. These are clear connections with Latin American literature. So it's really not a surprise at all that I enjoyed this poem so much, because we have those typical themes that are in common, in these two literatures. Now, here's something that you're not going to get from Latin American literature. The sins of past lives. That's a very important theme right here. So it comes the idea of bad karma, that has to be burnt, that has to be purged. It's an idea that comes, of course, from Buddhism. So this is a really, really key theme in this poem. The idea that Kiều has all this probably bad karma, maybe from previous lives, and that she has to get rid of that through good actions, through all of these really difficult situations that she endures and that she lives in this story. So I was thinking, because of that, and I was wondering as I read this poem, could we not read the story of Kiều as a kind of equivalent to Dante's Purgatorio? The idea of the Purgatorio, the purgatory, right? Purgatory is this state in which you get rid of all those negative actions, not from previous lives, right? But you know what I'm saying, right? All of this bad karma that you have to burn, that you have to get rid of. So maybe that's one way of looking at it. Maybe what Kiều is experiencing in this poem, in this story, is just the idea of getting rid of all those negative actions so that she can move on to happiness, to enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, from that perspective. Now, I want to touch upon the protagonist herself a little bit before we move on to a different topic. So as I said before, Kiều is a beautiful woman. She is also accomplished as an artist. And many times in the story, at least 3 times that I remember, you're going to notice that it is her way with words that actually gets her out of a difficult spot. And there's even one character that I remember that also, gets out of a difficult situation because this character happens to have a way with words. So the idea that expressing oneself properly, expressing oneself beautifully has value in this society is something that I really, really liked about this poem. Now, Kiều is committed to both love, in the sense of romantic love or eros, and also to family. But she puts family first. In the context of the poem, this of course leads to trouble, though we do not really necessarily have to see it as trouble. Maybe we can see it as just burning that bad karma, right? But in the human aspect, right, on this plane of existence, you can say that, yeah, her idea of putting family first leads her to a lot of trouble. But this is very important to emphasize. In the context of Vietnamese culture, this is not a tragic flaw. It's not the typical hamartia, that we are looking for when we look for that tragic flaw in a hero. This is not a tragic flaw. This is actually a virtue. So I did want to clarify that if we want to look for a tragic flaw, it's going to have to be something else. It's not going to be that idea of the commitment to family, because that is also what allows her to potentially burn that bad karma that she may have from previous lives. There's a recurring metaphor that since we're talking about the character, right, the protagonist, that Kiều uses. She compares herself to a fallen leaf, or sometimes she calls herself a broken leaf. So of course you can think of the fallen leaf as something that is subject to the wind, the whims of fate, of the wind and all that. And I made a very, very personal connection right here. There's a classic of Argentine rock that by Luis Alberto Spinetta. Okay, it's actually credited to his band Pescado Rabioso, which literally means rabid fish. Really interesting name for a band, but it's actually a song. It's more of a solo project by Spinetta, and the title of the song is "Todas las hojas son del viento." Literally translated, all leaves belong to the wind. Right, so you have a very similar idea right there. Right, of course, the wind is fate. Right, fate that's kind of blowing these leaves that are broken leaves, dry leaves, fallen leaves that are just blowing in the wind, to borrow another famous phrase. So the element of fate there, what it plays in her life. But above all, when it comes to her character, what I want to say is that, yes, Kiều is a very strong woman, definitely, okay? But you're going to notice that she experiences some moments of weakness. Okay, she is not superhuman. This is a very human character that we have here. And actually, now that I think about it, this is a really, really human poem also. I mean, besides the presence of dreams, that appearance that we have in a dream, there's really no supernatural element. And I don't even know that I would consider a dream to be a supernatural element in itself. Maybe the apparition, you could make a case for that. But what I'm saying here is that this is a deeply humanistic story, the Song of Kiều, or the Tale of Kiều. Now, I want to tell you about a film connection that I made. And this is even the first time that I read this poem, those 4 years ago. I kept thinking of a film that I had seen, and I was wondering, if there were really all of the connections that I thought there were, or if it was one of those cases where my memory was playing tricks on me, as tends to happen. And the film in question is The Life of Oharu by Kenji Misoguchi. I'm showing you the inside booklet instead of the actual cover because I took this from the library and it's full of these ugly stickers and everything. So I thought, okay, were there all of those connections? Am I just having bad memory, creative memory right here? There's only one way to find out. So I went to the library, I grabbed a copy, I rewatched it, and I was like, wow. Just wow. I mean, not because this is a masterpiece, which it is, right? But all of the connections that I found. So this film is based on a Japanese novel from the 17th century, The Life of an Amorous Woman. But there are so many connections to the story. I mean, we also have the tough life, the difficult journey of a woman right here. She also becomes a prostitute. She becomes a nun. She gets married to a person who is in power. So many connections. There are also some big differences. Okay, for example, Oharu the character in Misoguchi's film, is a court lady at the beginning of her story. So maybe in their origin you can see quite a difference right there in the characters. But still, I highly recommend this story as a companion piece. And actually, let me recommend it to you also because I'm about to make a video on it. I was like, since I have rewatched it and I enjoyed it so much and I have this connection to make with a book, I might as well talk about it too, because I have never talked about Misoguchi before in a video, and he is one of my favorite directors. So definitely check it out. Bottom line, I love, love, love the story of Kiều, and I think you should read it, my friend. Okay, I think definitely you've got to read it. And I mean, come on, it's only 150 pages long. It's gripping, it is fast paced. You can probably read this in one day. Okay, I read it in 3 days, but you know, I'm a slow reader and I was grading and doing a bunch of other stuff, so I think you can read this very quickly. Actually, let me read you the opening lines, okay, so just so that you get also a sense of the style right here, and just a few lines. So this is how it starts. It's an old story. Good luck and good looks don't always mix. Tragedy is circular and infinite. The plain never believe it, but good-looking people meet with hard times too. Okay, so I started it for you. All you need to do is just find a copy and continue with the reading. And I am sure that you're going to enjoy it very much. I just hope that you love it as much as I do. And I get the feeling that you will, because this is a very important story. It's a timeless story, and it's just beautiful. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on the story of Kiều by Nguyễn. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.